will die. Beyond death, they will die. So you have the glimmers of the doctrine of resurrection here. If these statements are true, and they are, then that implies that this life isn't all there is. The just shall live by faith. Live and live and live and live and live. I'm going to believe in a God who can break into my life in all of its twistedness and brokenness and weirdness and make me a man after his own heart and take me to live with him forever and forever. We move on then to that 19th chapter. God has made his point. You've got a choice to make now, Judeans. Don't blame your parents for who you are and for what your situation is. He goes on in chapter 19 to talk about Israel's present kings. And he gives us, again, these to us, very obscure pictures. To them, they weren't obscure at all. He describes a lioness who has some cubs. The lioness is Judah. And the first cub she has is Jehoahaz, that first son of Josiah we talked about last Friday. He was put on the throne, and then the Egyptians captured him and took him away in chains. The second cub who comes onto the throne seems to be Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim, his son, combined. At any rate, this second cub is taken away by the Babylonians. And so God says, if you're depending on the present kings, you're depending on lion cubs that have had their teeth pulled. They're not going to help you. They're not going to save you. Then he goes on in the 10th verse to another picture. Now it's of a vine, and the vine is Judah. And this vine has branches. And the branches reach out, but all of a sudden someone comes and uproots this vine, cuts it down, cuts off its branches, takes a little shoot of it and puts it out in the desert. And a sort of a, they call them a sport. A really odd branch sort of shoots out of it. The King James calls it a rod. Like the rod of Jesse in Isaiah. And this rod devours the rest of the plant. What's he talking about? He's talking about King Zedekiah. 22, 23 years old when he comes to the throne, and a weakling, a crook, and God, through Ezekiel, says, if you're depending on that guy who's on the throne now to get you out of this mess, he's going to eat you up. Okay, those two pictures, the lioness, the vine, both of them are saying, don't you depend on the present leadership. It's not going to do a thing for you except get you in deeper trouble. You've got to take responsibility for yourself. You know what an oxymoron is? It is a self-contradictory statement or phrase, such as honest politician. Isn't that tragic? Isn't that tragic? We've come to this place where our leaders are simply a subject, an object of scorn. How tragic. How sad. But that's where we are. And we can pray for them. We can exercise our constitutional right and try to vote the bums out. But it seems like the bums we vote out are replaced by the bums we voted for. Well, we cannot sit down and say, well... And personally, now I'm talking very personally here, I don't believe that God calls us to use political machination to try to get our point of view if the majority, in fact, are not in favor of our point of view. Now, we may use persuasion, we may use prayer, we may use every combination of influence we can to try to get the majority to take our position. Now, I'm talking personally here. That's the way I come at the thing. But the thing I want to say out of all of this is Ezekiel is saying, don't you trust the leadership to somehow save your situation. You've got to take responsibility for your own soul, your own life, your own character, your own family, your own influence. And don't blame somebody else, whether your parents or the leadership or whatever. Now, let's just quickly jump back to 17 because it's doing much the same thing. If you have the Wesley Bible, that's page 1211. By the way, I didn't realize that anybody was able to get copies of the Wesley Bible now. It is out of print. Thomas Nelson Publishers let it go out of print. So if the bookstore has any, buy them. You know, buy dozens. They'll be collector's items. Well, no, buy one and use it. Read it. I don't get any commission out of that. Okay. Chapter 17. Now he pictures an eagle. This eagle comes to Lebanon, and the eagle is Babylon. Babylon takes a twig off of the topmost branch of a great cedar. And this is Jehoiakim, that young king, that 18-year-old king who came to the throne just in time to surrender back there in 598. And the eagle has carried him off. Then the vine has grown up again. And the vine has bent its branches in one way toward Egypt, and then it has bent its branches another way toward Babylon. They made a covenant with Egypt. They broke it to make a covenant with Babylon. Then they got upset at Babylon. They broke that covenant and tried to make another one with Egypt. And God says, what do you think is going to be done with a bunch like that? In my name, they said, Egypt will serve you forever. In my name, they said, Babylon will serve you forever. And now they've broken both of them. And do you think I'm just going to let that pass? So again, this picture of a craven leadership that will do whatever seems to be expedient. They'll say one thing today and another thing tomorrow, all in the name of God. Don't depend on that bunch to get you out of your problems. Okay, that's chapter 17, which is sort of a lead-in to this section 18 to 24. Okay, we've talked about chapter 18, individual responsibility. We've talked about chapter 19. Don't depend on your present leadership to get you out of this mess. Now then, let's look at chapter 20. Israel's rebellious history. If you did your homework, if you read this material, you probably saw there's a pattern here in this chapter. God talks about various incidents in Israel's history, and there's a pattern. Each one is very similar. God reveals himself and promises blessings to his people. He starts out in Egypt. And initially, they accept the terms of God's offer. We'll do, O God, what you say. We'll follow you. We'll belong to you. But then what happens? They rebel. Here it is again. Rebel. Rebels. Rebellious house. We know what you want. We know what we should be. We will not do it. Take that. And God has given them patterns of behavior. Look at verse 13 of chapter 20. They did not walk in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which if a man does them, he will live by them. Now, these words that God uses here are very significant. This word that's translated in this version, judgments, maybe it's ordinances in yours. This is the idea of government. God offers a governed life that produces life. If you live according to my governing, you'll live. It's true, friends. It's true. If you are the child of an alcoholic, I can guarantee you, if you never drink alcohol, you will never become an alcoholic. I can promise you, if you and your husband or wife are virgins when you marry, and you never have sex with anybody else, you won't get syphilis. I can promise you, on down the line, if you live according to the government of God, you'll live. Not only for eternity, thank God for that, but in this life, God has created us according to certain standards. If you don't jump out of a tall building, you will not smash your head on the sidewalk. And God says, here are my standards. Here is the way I made life. Here's the way I made you to live. If you live that way, you'll live. You'll live a long life. Probably. This is a fallen world, and so tragedies, undeserved, can happen to the best of us. But if you take 1,000 people who are living by God's standards and 1,000 people who are thumbing their noses at God's standards, I guarantee you the life situation of this 1,000 will be better than the life situation of that 1,000. There may be individuals here who will have a better life than anybody in this group. And we say, God. And there may be people in this group who have a more tragic and terrible life than anybody in this group. And we say, God. But if you take them as a group, God says, you live my way, you'll live now and for sure forever. But they rebelled. And they said, no, God. Isn't it amazing? Goodness is always boring. And evil is so attractive. God says, here's the good way. Well, I suppose. And there's the evil way. Wow, isn't that interesting? You'd think we were a fallen race or something. No, God, we're not going to live by the way that gives life. We're going to live by the way that gives death. What is that way that gives death? Two things. We've seen them before, and we may see them again before 10:30. Number one, you worshiped idols and engaged in the illicit sex which is the result of idol worship. Write that down. You engaged in idol worship and the illicit sex that results from idol worship. Now, why is that? Idol worship is saying, I cannot trust the transcendent God to supply my needs. I have to figure out a way to manipulate this world to supply my needs. My needs are my own, and I got to supply them. That's idol worship, friends, whether you've got a statue in your house or not. And I guarantee you, keep on long enough in that pattern, and there will be a little statue in your house. Not in your generation, maybe, but they're coming. They're coming. There are groups in this country right now who are, and they're not witches. There are groups in this country right now, some of whom call themselves Christians, who are worshiping an image of the Mother Goddess. Right now. My needs, I've got to supply them. I've got to produce. And I've got to somehow manipulate this world to make it give me what I need. Well, if you do that, one of the most driving needs in your life is for sexual satisfaction. And if you take that in your hands, then anything is fair game. That's number one, idolatry and the illicit sex which springs from idolatry. And number two is oppression of the helpless, which springs from idolatry. I have my needs. I've got to supply them. I'm the supplier of my needs through my manipulation of my world. And so I'm sorry. It's too bad that you're littler than I am, but we got to get up somehow. And I don't know a better way than on the backs of the helpless. Oh, but if God has become the supplier of your needs, and you know that what you need is a lot more than sexual fulfillment, and you know that what you need is a lot more than advancement in this world, you can give your needs to Him, and you can rest and stop going from one weird sexual experience to the more weird one that's next. You can thank God for whatever He has given you. If it is celibacy, you can thank God for it. If it is the love of a spouse who understands you and cares for you and desires to meet your needs, you can say thank God. If it is a spouse who is himself or herself troubled and is not supplying your needs very well, you can thank God, who is the supplier of your needs. And that means you're free. You're free. Free to obey. Free to cherish people for who they are, not for what they can do for you. My dad was not like Billy Key's dad. I don't think anybody said of Glenn Oswalt, he's the holiest man I knew. But he was a good man. A man who loved the Lord. A man who went to church, took me and our family to church. I thank God for his memory. He lived 101 years. Been dead just 2 years now. I thank God for his memory. He was 45 when I was born. You talk about a generation gap. That was a generation gap. I feared him. He didn't beat me. But if he said, get up, I got up. But I will never forget, he worked like a dog 6 days a week. We had a little bitty farm. It was not able to support us after I was born as a surprise. So he went to work at a brass foundry in Mansfield, about 10 miles away. He would work for 8 hours a day in that brass foundry, come home and work for another 8 hours on the farm and fall into bed and get up the next day and start again. 6 days a week. Bang, bang, bang. Seventh day. That's God's day. I will never ever forget one summer, on Friday afternoon, we got all the hay raked. It was ready. It was cut. It was raked in the windrows. It was ready for the baler. We didn't own a baler. We asked our neighbor to do it for us. It was ready to be baled on Saturday. Just right, you know. It had only been cut about 4 days. It was just at the right level of dryness and freshness. Make great hay. And the neighbor didn't show up on Saturday. Sunday, the weather forecast called for rain in the evening and rain all day on Monday. You know, if you were raised on the farm, wet hay is the worst of all. You got to rake it again and try to get it dried out, and when it's baled, it's not as good. We got home from church that morning. It was a lovely, lovely sunny afternoon, sort of like this. Hot, but not unbearably hot. There was that hay laying there in those perfect windrows. I said, Daddy, we're going to bale that hay today? He looked at me as though I were from another planet. And then he looked away, off in the distance, and he said, I don't guess we need the hay that bad. God is the supplier of my needs, and I can trust Him. And if He rains on this hay, fine. I'd rather have hay that's rained on than hay that I got in my strength, in my time, in my way, showing God I can take care of myself, thank you. Rebels, I'll choose the way. I'll choose the government of my life. I'll serve myself. I'll meet my needs. Rebels, saying, yes, God, I love you, but I'll do it my way. Yes, God, here's my life, but no, my life is mine when it comes down to my needs. Rebels. But the pattern is that God says, I'm not going to destroy you, because if I did, my holy name would be profaned among the Gentiles. If you got your Bible open there, you can look at it. Chapter 20, verse 9 is the first example. I acted for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned before the Gentiles. Now, what does it mean to profane God's name? It's much more than an oath. And it's much more than cussing. Now, that is one way to profane God's name, no question about it. But it's much more than that. God's name is His character. It's His nature. It's His reputation. And His name, as the Bible tells us, is holy. His character, His reputation, His nature. What does that mean? It means He is different from all the world. At the bottom line, holy means different. He is different from all the world. He's different from the other gods because He's faithful. He's true. He keeps His word. He is unfailing love. That's holiness. Now He says, if I had destroyed you there in Egypt, the pagans would have said, oh, He's just like all the other gods. He's not holy. His nature, His reputation is no different from any of the other gods in the world. Forget Him. So God says, I didn't destroy you. In Egypt. Remember, they haven't even gotten on the road yet. And God says, I should have fried you right there. But He brings them out in love and grace and tenderness. Cross the Red Sea. And He offers them Himself and His promises. His government by which they could live. And they say, yeah, God, we'll do that. And 5 weeks later are dancing around a golden calf. Rebellion. And after they had eaten and drunk, it says they rose up to play. And you know what kind of play it was? Foreplay. They go together, idolatry and adultery. And God says, I should have fried you. But you remember Moses said, God, if you do that, the pagans will say you're just like all the other gods, fickle, unreliable, worthless. And God said, you're right, Moses. I'm glad you've learned the lesson. I'm not going to destroy them. The pattern keeps repeating itself through this 20th chapter. God has been faithful. God has been more than faithful. God has been incredibly gracious. God has been unbelievably merciful. And finally, there is no hope for these people except fire. Even now, God is not merely giving in to his just anger. Even now, God is not bringing this destruction upon them because he's saying, I'm done with you, I've had it, I'm going to destroy you, and I'm going to try it again on some other people. No. Even now, God is going to allow this thing to happen after the fourth or fifth reiteration of this cycle, because fire is the only hope for cleansing his people. What a God. What a God. Oh, when people say to you, oh, the God of the Old Testament, that's a God of wrath. You know one thing. They don't know the Old Testament. They probably never read it. Oh, is there anger here? Is there fury? Is there divine passion? Yes. Yes. But it's not a God who, if you look at him cross-eyed, says, bzzzt. You commit one sin and God says, whoa, man, boom, you're out of here. That is a misfortune of some Wesleyan Arminian theology. If a misfortune of Calvinist theology is the wrong suggestion, certainly Calvin never taught this, that you can sin with impunity, and because you went to an altar once, you're going to go to heaven anyhow. If that's a tragedy of that theology, the tragedy of our theology is this feeling you commit one sin and God's done with you. If they teach eternal security, we too often have taught eternal insecurity. No. 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 If you long to be his in your deepest heart, God's going to find a way. He's going to find a way. It may be through fire, but he's going to find a way to hang on to you. Oh, to be sure, there can come a day, may it never be for me or for any of us here, when we say, God, take your hands off me. I used to believe in you, but that was a bunch of trash. I want my own life. Get back. God will do it. God will do it. But I'll tell you what, it takes a lot of doing. Oh, he'll hold you. He'll keep you. You've broken his heart? Yes. You've failed him? Yes. But he's going to find a way, if you'll let him, to hang on to you. So, God says, I've not given up on you. We've got just a few moments left. Let's look at the remainder of this 20th chapter. It's too important to leave. God is not now, finally, after, I'd say, the fifth reiteration of this pattern, he's not now simply surrendering to his righteous anger. He's not going to destroy them.